If 1.4 billion people can care about one match, what else in human life is powerful enough to ignore war, politics, and borders? Because that is not normal influence, that is a force so big it starts bending the world around it. And the strange part is, the bigger football gets, the less anyone seems able to control it. So the real question is not why people watch it, but what football quietly reveals about power itself. And that is where this conversation starts. 1.4 billion for one match is absurd. That is not a sports event, that is a planetary glitch. How does anything stay that big when the world is this messy? Apparently by kicking a ball and pretending borders are optional. And the funniest part is it keeps getting bigger, not smaller. Most things in chaos shrink, this thing expands. I think that is what makes football weirdly powerful. It is one of the few things that still feels global. Even aliens would look down and be like, what are these people doing? Wars happening, visa bans, missiles flying, and everyone still shows up. That is such a human contradiction. Is that because football is above politics or because politics cannot fully touch it? I think the answer is a little ugly and a little brilliant. Go on, because now you are sounding like a guy in a blazer. I hate that for me, but okay. FIFA being an independent body matters more than people admit. Like, it is not a government, so it can dodge a lot of the direct pressure. Basically, the ultimate freelancer of world sports. Yes, exactly, no boss, just chaos and money. And once it became the top stage, everything else had to bend around it. You mean like the Olympics getting pushed aside in football? Pretty much, because the World Cup became the event for national pride. Olympic football looks like the warm-up act now. Brutal, but true. And the numbers are insane when you compare them. The Super Bowl gets massive American attention, but it is still mostly America. Right, it is huge, but geographically kind of trapped. The World Cup is basically every continent emotionally engaged at once. That is the difference. That is the cheat code. Even the World Baseball Classic cannot touch that scale yet. Shohei Ohtani can do wizard stuff, but he cannot summon nations. That line is ridiculous, but yes. A single football match can become a national mood swing. One goal and the whole country either rises or collapses. That is basically legalized emotional blackmail. Fans love being tortured, though. And FIFA learned how to package that into an event with endless scale. More teams, more matches, more countries thinking they belong on the stage. But is 48 teams always a good thing? There it is. The purity police has entered the chat. No, seriously, there is a trade-off between exclusivity and reach. If you expand, more people care, but the average quality might drop a bit. So you get more football and more 0-0 suffering. Exactly, but FIFA probably sees suffering as engagement. Their business model is not elegance, it is attention. And attention scales better than beauty does. That is true for most modern institutions, honestly. The other huge thing is that football survives because it is culturally sticky. Sticky how? You do not need expensive equipment, a closed arena, or elite access. 2 goalposts, a ball, and suddenly you have a civilization. That sounds like a prophecy written by a street kid. But it is why the sport spread everywhere and never really left. So when the World Cup arrives, it is not selling a new idea. Exactly, it is activating something already living in people. That is why governments struggle to control it. Even boycotts and scandals do not kill the core demand. But scandals should matter more than they do. They matter, then people get angry, then the next tournament sells out. Moral memory has a short halftime. That is evil but accurate. Because the event is bigger than the institution in people's minds. So they hate FIFA and still watch the World Cup? Constantly, and that is the real superpower. That is such a toxic relationship. Sports fans are basically in an abusive situationship with this thing. And somehow they keep coming back for more. Maybe because it still feels like one of the last shared rituals. That part is real, actually. In a fragmented world, shared attention is almost sacred. So the chaos outside the stadium almost makes the stadium matter more? Yes, because people want a place where the rules are legible. Outside is messy and political. Inside, at least, the argument has lines. Until VAR shows up and ruins the romance. VAR is just modern society in a booth. Endless review, no final piece. That might be the most honest thing about the whole sport. And yet none of that stops the World Cup from growing. Because scale itself becomes part of the myth? Exactly. Every cycle is bigger, louder, and more unavoidable. More countries, more stories, more heartbreak, more money. More heartbreak should honestly be in the official slogan. Fans would buy that merch immediately. And that is why it survives global chaos better than most institutions. It is not just surviving, it is feeding on the moment. Kind of, yes, because the world being unstable makes shared spectacle more valuable. People want proof that something still works, even if that thing is just 22 adults chasing a ball. When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous, and that is part of the magic. Maybe that is why it keeps winning against history. Yeah, because history is loud, but football is louder. That is a great place to land, annoyingly. Annoyingly correct is the best kind of correct. And then it just keeps going like none of the chaos matters. That is what messes with my head, honestly. Wars, bans, scandals, and the tournament is like, next stop, kickoff. It is the most arrogant little ball event on earth. But that arrogance is exactly the product. Product is the right word, which is kind of depressing. It is depressing until you see the numbers and then it gets insane. One match pulling over 1 billion people is not normal. A single 90-minute game doing that is absurd. That is bigger than most civilizations ever had eyeballs on anything. You always go from sports to anthropology in one breath. Because that is what this thing is, half sport and half human ritual. And ritual survives stuff that institutions cannot. Exactly, and football figured that out early. FIFA was built outside government, outside armies, outside the whole mess. Which also means outside accountability. Let us not romanticize it too hard. No, absolutely not. That part is filthy. But the independence gave it room to outlive political moods. So the whole genius was basically, do not let governments own the thing. And then let the thing become richer than governments. Which is a very dangerous sentence, but yes. That separation is why the World Cup became bigger than the Olympics for football. Because the Olympics had football, but it never felt like the final destination. The World Cup became the stage where the sport actually crowns itself. And countries lose their minds over it because the badge is the country. Exactly. Club football is tribal, but this is national ego on steroids. Which is why grown men turn into poets and animals at the same time. That is the cleanest description of a penalty shootout I have ever heard. And the scale keeps compounding because every cycle adds more people to the ritual. More teams, more countries, more stories, more reasons for somebody to care. Also more money, let us be honest about the engine. Of course, and FIFA knows exactly how to cash that in. They looked at global unity and saw inventory. That is so nasty and probably true. But if it were only greed, would people still care this much? No, the greed rides on top of something real. People need one shared thing that feels bigger than their politics. Which is funny because football is always dragged into politics anyway. Totally, but the tournament tries to make politics feel temporary. Temporary how? Like for 90 minutes, your flag matters more than your government. That is actually a wild emotional bargain. It is, and people take it instantly. That is why boycotts never fully kill the thing. They hurt it, but they also make it feel even more important. Right, the conflict becomes part of the myth. Nothing says global harmony like a tournament surviving a diplomatic meltdown. Bro, that is exactly the nonsense of it. And yet the nonsense keeps outlasting the serious systems. Do you think that is because football is simple enough to translate anywhere? Yes, you do not need a language pack to understand a goal. That line is almost too clean. I know it sounded fake even as I said it. But that simplicity is why it crosses borders better than almost anything. Yet the organization around it is anything but simple. That is where the whole thing gets shady. A sport with universal appeal controlled by a very small room of people is always risky. Tiny room, enormous ego, endless money. The most dangerous combo in history. But the structure also explains the growth, because they can move faster than states. So while governments argue, FIFA just books the next circus. And the circus gets bigger every time because nobody wants to miss the center ring. Especially when your country is in it. That is the emotional trap. You can hate the institution and still scream for the team. Human beings are morally flexible with scoreboards. Extremely flexible, almost yoga-level flexible. And that flexibility keeps the World Cup insulated from outrage. Not fully insulated, just more durable than people expect. What do you think is the real moat then? Scarcity, identity, and timing all at once. 4 years is a brutal wait, which makes people desperate when it arrives. And when something is rare, it becomes mythic. Also, it helps that the matches are short and the drama is constant. Football is basically a suspense machine with fitness requirements. That is why it travels better than sports with too many stoppages. So baseball needed Ohtani, basketball needed stars, but football already had the container. Exactly, the tournament itself is the superstar. That is crazy, because usually the player is the event. Here the country is the event and the player is the instrument. Which is why people project so much onto it. Pride, resentment, hope, revenge, all of it gets dumped in there. That is also why it gets ugly so fast. Yeah, the same engine that creates joy also creates obsession. And then someone starts yelling about referees like the fate of democracy depends on it. Which, to be fair, it kind of does in the group chat. But that chaos is part of why the World Cup survives the age of cynicism. Because people still want one thing that is bigger than the feed? Yes, one thing that breaks through the noise instead of adding to it. And for all its ugliness, football still does that. That sounds like a reluctant love letter. It is the most reluctant love letter ever written. Because I do not trust FIFA, but I absolutely trust the feeling. That is the key distinction, right? People are not worshiping the bureaucracy. They are worshiping the moment. The bureaucracy just invoices the moment. That should not be as funny as it is. And somehow, in a world falling apart, that moment keeps getting bigger. Maybe that is the whole answer. Not that the world is stable, but that people are desperate for something stable. Even if it is only stable for 90 minutes. Honestly, 90 minutes is enough when everything else is spinning. That is the most sports thing you have ever said. I know, I hate that it lands. Still, I get why the World Cup keeps expanding, because every cycle promises one more shared memory. And shared memory is basically the rarest currency left. Yeah, and football prints it on command. But how does that survive wars and boycotts without even blinking? Football just shows up like, sorry, I live here now. That's exactly it. It feels weirdly unstoppable. Because FIFA built it outside government control from the start. Which sounds noble until you realize nobody can really tell them no. That independence is either genius or a loophole with a logo. And once the World Cup became bigger than the Olympics for football, it was over. Wait, bigger than the Olympics in just one sport? Exactly, because one event beats a crowded festival when the whole planet only cares about one match. People really will ignore every other problem for a knockout game. And FIFA learned that attention is more powerful than ideology. I hate how true that is, because then everything becomes a numbers game. Exactly, and the numbers are insane now. One final drawing more than 1.4 billion people is not normal. It sounds fake until you remember every household has one uncle screaming at a screen. Sometimes the uncle is the entire country. And that is why they keep adding teams, right? More teams means more nations think they have a shot at the party. Or more teams means more money, which is probably the real sentence. It is absolutely the real sentence. But money works because hope works first. So the commercial machine is feeding on emotional hunger? Pretty much, and football is the cleanest delivery system for it. That is such a ruthless way to describe a sport. I love it. Ruthless, but not wrong. Think about it. No other sport can turn a single goal into national mythology that fast. One goal, and suddenly the entire country is alive again. Or dead, depending on the penalty shootout. Penalty shootouts are just legal trauma. And somehow the most watched trauma on Earth. But why does geopolitics barely slow it down? Because the tournament is global enough to absorb the chaos instead of being defined by it. That feels almost too convenient, like sport gets a hall pass. It does get a hall pass, and that is the uncomfortable part. But people also need a place where the world can still look coherent. So the World Cup becomes this temporary fake peace. Not fake, just selective, which is even stranger. That is a very diplomatic way to say everyone is ignoring the fire for 90 minutes. Because the ball is on the other side of the fire. And the whole thing survives scandals too, which is wild. Oh, FIFA scandals are practically part of the branding at this point. That organization has been messy for so long that messiness feels structural. Yet the event itself stays bigger than the institution. Which is insane because most organizations die when the corruption gets loud. Football is bigger than the people running it, and that protects it. Kind of like a giant franchise that outgrew its own owners. Exactly, and the owners still act surprised. But do you think the growth can keep going forever? Not forever, but way longer than anyone comfortable should expect. What would actually slow it down? Maybe if the audience stopped believing the event could mean something real. And that would be a much bigger crisis than any boycott. Way bigger, because then the ritual breaks. That is the thing. The World Cup is basically ritual at scale. Like religion, but with offside traps and terrible weather. And way more screaming. Religion with VR would be unbearable. Imagine a referee review in the middle of a miracle. People would riot in slow motion. Still, the weird part is how the event keeps absorbing bigger worlds. Bigger worlds meaning more countries, more media, more politics. Exactly, and every layer makes it more valuable. Or more fragile, depending on how you look at it. Yeah, but fragile things can still be enormous. That is probably the best description of modern football. Huge, fragile, absurd, and somehow still beloved. That should be the official slogan, honestly. The crazy thing is, people almost trust the tournament more than the world around it. Because it repeats, right? It gives calendar certainty. Yes, it gives structure when everything else feels improvisational. And structure sells, emotionally and commercially. God, that sounds like a boardroom and a therapy session at once. Which is basically global sports. So the World Cup keeps growing because chaos makes it more necessary? Pretty much. Because the messier the world gets, the more people crave one shared screen. And for a little while, that screen makes strangers feel related. I hate how beautiful that is. Same, it is annoyingly beautiful. Which means the World Cup is not just a tournament anymore, is it? No, it is the planet trying to remember itself in public. Damn, that is actually a hard ending. Yeah, and the next cycle will still somehow be bigger. And that is the weird part. It grows even when everything else looks broken. Like in a normal world, chaos should shrink attention, not boost it. But football is basically chaos with better branding. Exactly. And FIFA somehow built a machine that eats disorder for breakfast. Though I do wonder if the growth is pure love or just pure spectacle. It is both, which is honestly the problem and the genius. Because the World Cup is not just a game, it is a global habit. And habits are insanely powerful when billions of people share them. Especially when the habit has flags, national pride, and instant heartbreak. Bro, football sells drama better than most entertainment industries. But how did it get this untouchable in the first place? By becoming independent enough to survive governments, wars, and ego trips. That non-government thing is so underrated, right? Completely, because once it is not tied to one state, it feels less capturable. Which is hilarious because it still ends up acting political every 5 minutes. Of course it does. It is a global event, not a chess club. But the structure matters because it lets the tournament outlive single crises. Exactly. Wars happen, boycotts happen, scandals happen, and the cup just keeps showing up. That part is almost offensive, honestly. Offensive to our sense that history should pause for dignity. But sports rarely pause for dignity. They usually pause for broadcasting rights. Brutal, but yes. And that is why it survived the Olympic shadow too, right? Yeah, football outgrew being just another Olympic event and built its own temple. Olympic football was basically the opening act that got too famous. Wait, that is actually a perfect way to say it. The World Cup gave the sport a dedicated stage, and the stage made the sport bigger. That feedback loop is insane when you think about it. More attention means more money means more teams means more attention. Which also means more reasons for people to complain about the scale. Oh, people complain about everything, especially when it works. Still, the 48-team expansion is a statement, not just a formatting change. It says the event does not want to be smaller, ever. Smaller is for people with self-control. FIFA clearly does not believe in self-control. They believe in scale, because scale is what makes the whole ecosystem addictive. But is there a ceiling somewhere? Like, can it just keep expanding forever? Not forever, but long enough to feel unstoppable for a generation. And that is usually all institutions need to become mythic. Mythic is such a good word for it because people stop seeing the machinery. They just see the anthem, the stadiums, the heartbreak, the replay, and the endless ads pretending to be emotionally profound. Bro, the commercial break during a global event is its own religion. But that commercial layer is part of why it keeps growing, no? Absolutely, because it turns emotion into infrastructure. Emotion into infrastructure is a wild phrase. But that is basically modern sport. The fans bring meaning, the sponsors bring fuel, and FIFA takes a cut. That last part is where people start muttering into their drinks. Yeah, because everyone loves the cup until they notice the rent being charged. Still, the scale is hard to argue with when a final hits over 1 billion viewers. 1 billion is not a sports number, that is a civilization number. Exactly, and that is why it feels above ordinary politics. But it is not really above politics, it just floats over them. Like a very expensive balloon. A balloon with security badges and broadcast deals. And yet countries still show up even when tensions are ugly. Because showing up is part of the prestige, even when the world is on fire. It is like nobody wants to be the one left outside the photograph. That is actually sad. It is sad, but it is also the core of its power. So the World Cup is basically an annual reminder that inclusion itself is a currency? Yes, and exclusion is so loud that everyone tries to avoid it. Which is why even controversial hosts still get the parade. The parade is what makes people furious, though. Of course, because the event can feel morally messy and still be irresistible. That contradiction is probably the entire story. Yeah, people hate the politics and still cannot look away from the match. Human beings are not known for clean consistency. Thank God, because otherwise this would be a very boring species. The World Cup understands that contradiction better than almost any institution. It gives you unity and then immediately sells you division in the group stage. That is nasty work, honestly. And the nastiest part is that people love it more because of the tension. Maybe global chaos does not weaken these events. Maybe it feeds them. Yeah, because the cup is one of the few places where the whole world still agrees to care. Even if it is only for 90 minutes at a time. And then everyone goes right back to arguing. But that little pause is enough to keep the myth alive. Exactly. And once a myth becomes annual, it starts to feel inevitable. Inevitability is the most profitable thing in the world. That should be on FIFA's office wall, honestly. So we are basically watching a machine that turns uncertainty into appointment viewing. That is the cleanest way to put it. And somehow it keeps getting cleaner as the world gets messier. Which is why the next one will probably be even bigger than this one. Yeah, and we will all pretend to be surprised again. Wait, how does something get bigger when everything else is falling apart? That is the most World Cup sentence ever. It is almost like chaos gives it more oxygen. Or it is just the one thing everybody agrees to watch. Which is rare because humans cannot agree on lunch. But they can agree on 90 minutes of collective suffering. Especially when their team misses an open goal. Oh man, that pain is international. The insane part is that the final alone hits over 1 billion people. 1 billion for one match is absurd. And that is just one night, not the full tournament. That is why the Olympics comparison always feels a little unfair. Yeah, because the Olympics is many small peaks, not one giant punch. The World Cup is the punch. One knockout blow to your productivity for a month. And that concentration is what makes it commercially insane. More matches, more countries, more eyeballs, more money. Classic expansion logic. But expansion always sounds cleaner than it feels. You mean the 48-team format? Yeah, because part of me loves more chaos, but part of me is like, wait, why? Because FIFA knows scarcity and prestige both make the product stronger. And also because money likes extra matches. Money loves extra matches the way toddlers love candy. But does the World Cup lose magic when everybody gets in? That is the real debate, honestly. Because if qualification feels easy, the stakes drop. And then every nation starts acting like it deserves a parade. Which, to be fair, they absolutely do if they make it. True, one World Cup appearance can become national mythology. That mythology is part of the engine. And FIFA has always understood that this is bigger than sport. The non-government thing matters a lot there. Because they can move like a private empire instead of a state body. Which is a terrifyingly efficient business model. Terrifying, yes, but also weirdly stable. Stable through wars, boycotts, all of it. Pretty much, because the tournament became a ritual people refuse to lose. That is the wild thing. The ritual outlasts the politics. Or the politics get absorbed by the ritual. Exactly, and then everybody pretends football is neutral. Neutral like a casino is neutral. Bro, that is actually perfect. But is that unfair, or is that just how global culture works? I think culture always claims neutrality when it is really power with better branding. Oof, that is annoying because it is true. And the World Cup is probably the cleanest example of that. Because everyone wants to be part of it, even the people complaining about it? Exactly. They are mad and still clearing their calendar. The most honest protest is still watching quietly. That is brutal, but fair. And the broadcast numbers prove it every single time. What amazes me is how it survives controversy without shrinking. Because scandals usually kill trust, right? They kill trust in institutions, not necessarily in the event people love. Fans will hate the office and still worship the trophy. That is such a clean distinction. So FIFA can be messy and the World Cup can still feel pure? That split is the whole trick. It is also kind of depressing. Why depressing? Because people forgive institutions if the spectacle is good enough. And now every big event wants to become spectacle first, meaning second. Welcome to modern civilization. That should be carved on the stadium entrance. Still, there is something weirdly beautiful about countries stopping for a match. Yeah, for a moment everybody is looking at the same screen. In a fragmented world, that matters more than people admit. It is one of the last shared global rituals left, which is probably why it keeps growing, honestly. Not just growing, but absorbing more of the planet's attention. And the next step is just more countries, more games, more noise. More noise is basically the official strategy now. FIFA should put that on a poster. I mean, they probably would if it sold hospitality packages. So the real genius is not that football escaped politics. It is that it learned how to survive inside politics without admitting it. That is such a dangerous superpower. Dangerous, but incredibly durable. And durable things always win the long game. At least for now. Yeah, until the next cycle arrives and everybody acts shocked again. Which, to be fair, we absolutely will. And then we will all sit back down for the next one.